Well, good evening. You're watching Asia in Review. Our program this evening is entitled North Korea's Crumbling Facade. I'm your host, David Day. And if you've been following the evolvement of news and developments regarding North Korea over the past several weeks, you'll notice some strange, seemingly contradictions. Some of these events may or may not be connected. Remember that Kenneth Bae is held while Meryl Newman is released. Kim Jong Un has his mentor, Jang Song-thaek, executed, and good old Dennis Rodman arrives to hold basketball tryouts to set up an NBA exhibition game with the North Korean team. What's interesting is that the North Korea policy wonks and observers are all over the map as to why all this is happening and what it really means for the future of the Hermit Kingdom. And our program this week kicks off the new year with a close look at the evidence that's available on the ground in North Korea regarding these important events. And what we're going to do is turn to the really fascinating perspective of an American who has recently returned from yet another trip to North Korea, to develop an understanding as to the real why behind these events and what's really going on, and to understand the ramifications of these bizarre and seemingly inconsistent events. And we want to turn now to our special guest, citizen diplomat and veteran Hawaii North Korea traveler, Mr. Patrick Border. And Pat, thank you for taking your time, and welcome again to ThinkTech.
It's my pleasure. I love to talk about this topic. It's been a lifelong source of fascination for me, and it won't stop.
You know, ladies and gentlemen, this man that you see before you is really a real rarity in the United States. In my mind, he's one of our true living treasures on the topic of North Korea, because there are a lot of policy wonks and observers that look at North Korea and study it. These are academics and diplomats and so forth, but they're looking at North Korea from the outside in. And Pat Border has had I think fair to say, a lifelong love of the Korean Peninsula and its people and its culture. And he has made several trips to North Korea and is able to give us a fascinating perspective that you won't read about or you won't see about anywhere else. And so, having said that, Pat, I'd like to ask you and kind of start this conversation first with, you know, this kind of strange collection of events that we've seen over the past several weeks. I mean, we have this chap, Kenneth Bae, who's held, another visitor, the elderly pensioner,
Meryl Newman, yeah,
who's released. And Mr. Producer, just to help our audience here, how about let's show our audience a visual number 8A here. And ladies and gentlemen, this is Kenneth Bae, and Pat, let's talk about him first. Who is this chap, and why is he being held, and why is he not being released?
Well, you have correctly noted that these are a collection of events which are unrelated in time and unrelated in the actions of the people involved. Kenneth Bae is a person who wishes to bring the Christian faith into North Korea, which is one of the cardinal no-nos. They don't like it, and of course we can debate forever whether they're closed-minded about it. My view on Kenneth Bae is that in 1962 we said, don't bring God into schools. Today, North Korea says, don't bring your God into our country. Can they do that? I believe they can, and I think the efforts to bring in Bibles and sneak in through China, all of these are connected events that I think, raise reasonably in the minds of the North Koreans the question as to whether or not their sovereignty and their rules of engagement, their mores, are being violated. One of the things that is very characteristic about travel in North Korea is that the British are as able to get into any corner of that country that they want, because the British have diplomatic ties.
Okay.
They have recognition. But the one thing that the Koreans are still skittish about is having Americans go to border cities. The entire time that I've been traveling there, non-Americans are able to, while we fly into the country, non-Americans can leave by train. Americans, by contrast, must fly out of the country as well. And the reason is because we would otherwise pass through the border city of Sinwiju in the northwest corner of Korea.
What's the problem?
The problem is they don't want to have Koreans, or I'm sorry, they don't want to have Americans close to their border because people are sneaking in surreptitiously. They're not coming into the port of entry, and they're bringing in Bibles, and they're bringing in video cameras and the sorts of things that are meant to expose the underbelly of Korean society. So if they bring in cameras, either still cameras or worse yet, video cameras, cell phones, these things can be used to expose the more extreme aspects of the regime. So there are videos of children starving, literally dying on the sidewalk. And of course, we're not taken to those places. I would concede that point. In 4 trips, I haven't gotten any close, anywhere near to anyone who is starving.
Well, was that Kenneth Bay's sin that he tried to, in addition to the Bible, Christianity proselytizing, was that his sin, as he didn't enter the country through Pyongyang by air?
Well, he entered the country through China, and his stated goal is to bring Christianity, and he's a combination tour organizer and Christian advocate, and they don't want that in their country. And that's why I guess you could predict that he'll eventually be released, but they do not want people purposely coming into their country with a view toward undermining the regime and introducing Christianity, and they've made that clear as plainly as you can.
Okay, and so that's why, now quick question, maybe yes or no. Kenneth Bay's incarceration in North Korea, is there any connection with this execution of Uncle Jang?
I don't see any at all, and I don't think it is. There were a series of activities, including an outright skirmish between the Workers' Party forces, military forces, under the influence of Comrade Chang, and those under the military. The battle that has been back and forth because of the young general's indecision is one that is over money.
Okay, well, we'll come back to that in a moment.
All right.
Let's go, Mr. Producer, down to visual number 10. I'm sorry, number 9. Number 9. And this is this elderly pensioner from the United States, Merrill Newman. And so he is held, and this picture shows him delivering some kind of a confession, I believe. And so why was he released and Kenneth Bay not released? I mean, is there any connection between those two?
What is very significant about Mr. Newman is the fact that now that he's been released, you're not hearing much from any side, not from the North Koreans, not from the State Department in our country, about the dynamics of Mr. Newman. He was present on the peninsula during the Korean War, and he trained partisans. And of course, during the war, people switched sides some, depending upon whether they were captured by the other
Sure,
side
okay,
in a
okay.
north incursion or a south incursion. For a variety of reasons, people switch sides. Mr. Newman's goal was an unusual one. First of all, he came into the country with a Chinese tour, which is a fairly telltale sign that it's unusual. That would be enough to raise eyebrows already, because he's not a Chinese speaker, and yet he's coming in with the tour from China. Most people come in either the British tours, which are the longest standing tours and the ones that are constantly being run. Even right now, in the dead of winter, in New Year's, at Christmas and New Year's, you can now go in to North Korea. And those people on the established tours, both British and American, but particularly the British tours, are going full blast. They've got all kinds of things. You can sign up for the Pyongyang Marathon. You can sign up for the International Film Festival in the autumn. In other words, there is scarcely a ripple. In fact, I will tell you, if you contacted Koryo Tours and asked them to even comment on Mr. Newman, they won't even comment on it. As far as they're concerned, it's a non-event, and they're going merrily along with all their tours, taking several thousand people a year in. My point is that Mr. Newman's situation is one that I would say neither the Koreans nor the Americans chose to make an event. Newman came in, his stated purpose for coming in was to meet up with people whom he trained during the war, and this would be people who eventually went with the North. And the idea was to get together with these people and chat and pray. Once again, you find one of the mores of North Korea being violated. Now, is this a major event? No, it's concluded. They detained him on the airplane. It seemed ominous at the time. And I will tell you that the State Department has now issued its latest missives warning people against all travel to North Korea. That's the first time that the State Department has actually suggested that all travel be curtailed. So,
will that State Department missive, will that affect your plans to visit North Korea in the future?
I would always be cautious, but I feel that having traveled on 4 occasions with a tour that is well regulated by people who are very spontaneous and fun-loving and who know when to act up and when not to. Let me give you an example that I think you.
So wait a second. Hold.
Okay.
So your answer is no.
My answer is no.
With caution.
Ultimately, a well-planned tour would not dissuade me from travel because of the State Department warning, because I think the State Department warning is a slap at North Korea, and it's a half-hearted effort. I don't think it's not commensurate with the risk. Americans have been going in for the past 20 years. This past year, I was one of about 2,000 Americans to go in. In 2010, I was one of about 150. So the numbers of Americans going to North Korea is increasing exponentially, and that's not going to change.
Let's go, Mr. Producer, to visual number 10, if we could. And this is Kim Jong Un's friend, Mr. Dennis Rodman, who was just in Pyongyang for some tryouts for an exhibition NBA basketball game. And I guess he is one of your competitors as a citizen diplomat of the United States. Why is Rodman able to organize and build this relationship and planning to set up an NBA exhibition game when all this other stuff is going on in North Korea, these various other events?
As far as I'm concerned, Dennis Rodman is an ally. Anybody who opens up the fascinating but secretive country of North Korea is a friend of mine. So I wouldn't count him as competition at all. I do note the very interesting 2 things that I would point out. One is that during this trip, when Mr. Rodman was in North Korea, he didn't meet with Kim Jong Un. Perhaps the new leader is too busy. He certainly has enough reasons to be too busy for recreation. The other thing is that the British tour company has already organized a trip to North Korea to see the exhibition basketball game between the Americans and the North Korean team. So in other words, every time you think that things are going to dial back, they just get bigger. I mean, you can now go see a basketball game that was organized by Dennis Rodman.
All right, all right. Well, we'll have more when we come back after the break. We're going to be talking about the execution of Uncle Jang. I'm David Day, your host here at Asian Review. We're talking about North Korea's crumbling facade with citizen diplomat Patrick Porter, and we'll see you on the other side of the break.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Horry for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Horry. Mahalo.
In case you just joined us, you're watching Asian Review. I'm your host, David Day. Our show today is entitled North Korea's Crumbling Facade, and our special guest is the United States living treasure on North Korea, citizen diplomat Patrick Porter, who's made many trips to North Korea and provides a level of perception and wisdom about North Korea that I don't think you'll find anywhere else. Pat, at the front part of the show, we talked about these unusual events. Some of them seem contradictory. The holding of Kenneth Bay, the release of Merrill Newman, the Dennis Rodman basketball game, and do any of these three events, are they connected in any way with the execution of Uncle Jang Song-thaek?
I think not. I think these are isolated incidents, and they're just, it's the perils of North Korea in its death rattle.
Mr. Producer, let's go to visual number 1 here. And ladies and gentlemen, this is or was a very important North Korean leader. And Pat, if you can tell us a little bit about this man while you're talking, I'll communicate with the producer and we'll put some visuals up. So if I'm introducing you or interrupting you, please excuse me. But
no, you have some very good photos, and I do want the people to see those as we're going along. So by all means, interrupt me.
So who is this chap?
Jang Song-thaek is the brother-in-law of Kim Jong-il. He married Kim Jong-il's sister. Therefore, the sister is the daughter of Kim Il-sung, and so she's the younger sister of Kim Jong-il, 75 years old at present, and apparently, from what we're told, estranged from Mr. Chang by a number of years. At the time that the decision was made to try and execute Chang, she was said to have exhibited no resistance to it.
Mr. Producer, let's go to visual number 4 if we could. And Pat, how about talk about what you see in this photo and why it's important?
A peculiar tendency on the part of Koreans, both Northerners and Southerners, is to place the decedent's coffin on top of the car that takes it to its place of burial. The two people who you see walking alongside the car at Kim Jong-il's funeral are Kim Jong Un, the new supreme leader, and right behind him, Jang Song-thaek, the very individual that we're speaking of, who has since been executed.
Is that positioning significant to you, that they're on the same side of the car?
He was said 2 years ago to be quietly operating as the number 2 man in a culture that doesn't have number 2 men, and that was why he was so significant. He worked quietly, and that analysis back in 2011 turned out to be, for the most part, true. Jang Song-thaek was an entrepreneur in a world that didn't have entrepreneurs. He was the direct contact between North Korea and China.
All right, hold for China for just a second here. Let's take a look very quickly, Mr. Producer, at photo number 6, if we could. And this photo, I think, illustrates the point that you just made, Pat, that this is the mentor uncle behind the young new dictator following his father's death.
It is. The circled image is that of Jang Song-thaek, who, interestingly, you see him in this image wearing a suit. In some images, particularly recent ones, you also see him wearing a military uniform. The significance of that...
Well, let's go to photograph number 5 here, because that, and he would be in the suit on the far right in this whole sea of military uniforms. So, and that's Kim Jong Un in the center. So your point about him being seen in a suit and then in a military uniform and back and forth, what is
the
that?
Power centers and the struggle that resulted in his death were between the Workers' Party of Korea, which is shown in the images of people, including the supreme leaders, as dressed in either Western attire but civilian attire, or the Eastern Mao costume, which Kim Jong Un favors, but he favors dark blue, unlike his father, who wore the green costume. But the battle is between these two very strong institutions, and the struggle was between those who saw economic reform as the way toward a prosperous North Korea versus those who favored military force, or military first is what they call it. And in that battle, that was what made Jang Song-thaek a casualty. What happened, the incident which caused Chang's death was that the very lucrative fisheries industry along the west coast, that is the Pyongyang side of North Korea, was first awarded by Kim Jong Un from the military to the Workers' Party. So in other words, that source of income was designated as part of the income to the Workers' Party.
Taken away from the military.
And then, yes, and then Kim Jong Un reversed himself and awarded that source of income back to the military. So here you see a struggle between two sources that want lucrative forms of income. And Kim Jong Un seems undecided in that regard. When he re-awarded the fisheries income to the Workers' Party and then back to the military, Jang Song-thaek, the recent decedent and very powerful person, resisted that. And there was literally a military skirmish between two different forces. And in the process, some high-ranking military officers who were loyal to Kim Jong Un were killed. That was the point where Kim became, whether you call it cautious or paranoid or angry or impulsive, probably it's a lot of those impulses. That's when Kim took the steps that he took, and you have photos.
Well, let's go to really talk a little bit further about the economic and the reform side. This Uncle Jang Song-thaek represents the kind of the economic reform part of the North Korean leadership. And Mr. Producer, let's go to photograph numbers 7 and 8 here. And you started earlier, Pat, and I interrupted you to talk about the influence that Uncle Jang had with China and how significant that was.
Yes, if you go to those photos, this is a photo with Wen Jiabao, who is the the premier and one of the three top officials. What is interesting is that he's not shaking hands with Kim Jong Un or Kim Jong Il because they were never the contact people. The contact person was none other than Chang Song-thaek.
This was in the past.
He's the entrepreneur. He was the entrepreneur, the keen, savvy businessman who could deal with the Chinese and get the best deals with them. And so with this photograph, and then I think you have one with former President Hu Jintao,
right,
recently retired, and once again, the individual who was making direct contact with him and doing the negotiating is none other than Chang Song-thaek, the entrepreneur, and the man. And I'll just tell you, David, if he has to have had a lot to do with the growth of the tour industry. So the fact that I can, from the 90s to the present day, just get into North Korea was because he was the guy who saw that as an income source.
Does this mean that, and let's go, Mr. Producer, to photograph number 2 here, and this, I guess, is this photograph marking the beginning of the end of a economic reform era?
No, but it's the end for Chang. He is being unceremoniously lifted. I don't even think, from the reports that we have, I don't think his feet were touching the ground. 2 rather burly guards have been summoned to remove him. This is such a shock that the current premier of North Korea, while he was pronouncing the harsh verdict on Chang, was actually in tears. These people worked so closely, and Chang had such respect that the premier who was responsible for condemning him and banishing him did so tearfully. And this is a dramatic photo, something you would have never seen really in the entire history of North Korea. He is being bodily dragged out of his chair at the front. He probably was generally aware before then that he was losing position, although he had been banished before and then rehabilitated later. This time it was not to be.
And photograph number 3, Mr. Producer. Here we have him
in total humiliation, literally bowed over with 2 fairly low-level gendarmes. These are not people at the top of the food chain themselves. They're soldiers, and they're just simply dragging him out. And you can see that he's, I'm sure, very much in shock at the degree of fall that he's experienced. At the very end, he would not have imagined that this would be his fate, and you can sort of see that from the drama of the photos.
You know, the North Korea has reported that Chang was executed by machine gun, and you've talked earlier about the fisheries incident, the greed motivation, and before the break, let me ask you a question here about is Chang's killing, does it make a difference in North Korea? Is it good or is it bad?
It is, depending upon the goal of the person asking the question, I would say it's both. In fact, it's all those things. It's good, it's bad, it's necessary for progress if you view it in the light of how other regimes have come to their end when they needed to. This was a step. If you look, for instance, to the Philippines, the ascent of Corazon Aquino was a good thing. But before that happened, Benigno Aquino had to be assassinated on the tarmac at the airport. It was that one step too far.
We'll come back to this one step too far after the break, because there's more to this, I think. Pat, I want to talk with you about the collapse of the Soviet Union and some of the other people's power revolutions and the importance of people's power, how that might play into the execution of Uncle Chang. When we come back after the break, you're watching North Korea's crumbling facade here on Asian Review. I'm your host, David Day. Stay with us. We'll see you on the other side of the break.
We want to
thank our underwriters.
Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve.
Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company.
The High-Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism.
Castle and Cook Hawaii, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state.
Hawaii Gas, formerly the Gas Company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future.
Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions.
I'm Nicole Horry. Thanks so much for joining us on ThinkTech.
I'm Maria Kashem. See you next time.
We're back. I'm your host, David Day. You're watching Asia in Review, coming at you live from Pioneer Plaza at the core of downtown Honolulu here. We're talking about North Korea's crumbling facade with citizen diplomat and veteran North Korea traveler from Hawaii, Mr. Patrick Border. And Pat, right before the break, you were talking about this whole execution of Uncle Jang Song-thaek as being kind of a bridge too far for the government, and you cited the example of the execution of Ninoy Aquino on the tarmac at Manila International Airport as the beginning of the People's Power Revolution and allowing the rise of Corazon Aquino. There are other People's Power revolutions that we probably ought to mention to the audience, and then why don't you give some other examples that come to mind?
I think it is important. One of the things that you notice about the fall of regimes is that they are very much subject to what Malcolm Gladwell called the tipping point. Tipping points don't happen gradually. They happen suddenly, and when you get there, change happens very rapidly. It wasn't just the killing of the father of the current president of the Philippines which caused the fall of Marcos. Other things had to occur as well, not the least of which was Ted Koppel's Nightline challenge to Marcos to hold elections. Marcos, the non-astute politician that he was, fell for that sucker punch, had an election, and lost it. So there are other events as well, but when it reached the tipping point at Camp Aguinaldo in downtown Manila, the forces of the military simply would not take up arms against the people of the Philippines. So when the people flooded the street, the army said no. That was the end of it. Marcos lost his force that he could use to enforce his will, and without even finishing dinner, he hopped on a helicopter and came to Hawaii. And so it happened with such speed as to cause the head to spin.
We've seen other People's Power events. There was the one in Korea, right?
Well, there was one in South Korea in 1988. Of course, President No Tae-woo presided over the Olympic Games. He was actually allowed to inaugurate the Games. But when he announced that he wanted to seek re-election, 1.5 million people were out in the street, and Chongno Boulevard, right there at the Kwangwamun Gate, and they clogged the street. And all of a sudden, No decided, well, maybe it's time for my retirement. I don't need to serve another term. He, with the speed that was exhibited by Lyndon Johnson in 1968, all of a sudden he said, I think I'll retire. And so people power made the difference. People power made the difference in the Soviet Union as well, and I would argue that the way that manifested itself was when Gorbachev was momentarily kidnapped, and they tried to overthrow him, and Boris Yeltsin stepped forward and said, no, release him. But that was really the tipping point, because Yeltsin's power as the president of Russia exceeded Gorbachev's, and from that point forward, by 1992, Christmas Day, Gorbachev handed over the keys to the Kremlin and walked away. The Soviet Union, as of that date, no longer existed. And it was a shock to everybody. You saw the same thing when the wall came down in Berlin. The only reason to have two Germanys was because of communism.
Right,
There are two different economic systems competing with each other, and as soon as the communism fell, and it fell, God, with the speed of summer lightning, really, Egon Krenz, the leader from East Germany, tried to hold together the parliament, but within months that fell, and now we have the Federal Republic of Germany, reunited Germany, incidentally with an East German chancellor. Angela Merkel has been notably successful, and she was an East German politician before. But these things happen with such speed.
They go like this. I mean, we saw the same thing with Suharto's collapse in Indonesia, and all the rioting and the people in the streets, and then we saw in the Arab winter or spring.
The Arab Spring. You saw it in Romania, where Ceausescu was caught so far off guard that he didn't even know to escape. He and his wife Elena ended up in the city square, back down on the pavement with their eyes gouged out of their heads.
Well, so are you saying that the notion of people's power hits a tipping point, and that in order to hit that tipping point, the regime or the government almost has to
they have to overreach.
They have to overreach. It's like they got to take a bridge too far.
Right.
And so where does this execution of Uncle Jang fit in this concept of that you're talking about?
That's what we don't know. I have actually heard commentators. I heard a commentator just the other day on the financial channel, CNBC, suggest, in fact, predict outright that 2014 is the year that North Korea will fail and simply cave in on itself and need assistance from the world and South Korea to reunify. I wouldn't be so bold as to predict that. Is this the first step or the final step? I think you have to get to the point where Korean families find themselves sending their sons off to battle, after combat. But this was what happened between the Workers' Party forces and the Korean People's Army was more than a skirmish.
Okay,
so is that enough to make the end happen? I don't know. And I'm not sure there's anybody who's qualified to say, but boy, it certainly qualifies as a first step at least.
Okay, so what we got is, as a consequence of this armed conflict within North Korea between the military and the Workers' Party over this fisheries incident that gets the #2 man executed. What we've got are people choosing sides within the country, right? Isn't that what happens?
Not only do you have people choosing sides, but what is an utter disaster, what's the shot in the foot for the North Koreans is the fact that it can no longer be portrayed to its own people as a workers' paradise. Now, for the first time, the average Korean on the street is aware of conflict. They've always been aware that they're not at the top of the economic food chain because they've got people like me coming in. I'm a virus. I'm no good to that regime.
What do you mean you're a virus?
Because the moment I step in, the bar is set so low for Americans that I can meet it effortlessly. I'm not a murderer, and by the way, I'm well dressed.
Okay.
And I'm able to give to my tour guides tips that literally change their financial future. The typical Korean tour guide who speaks fluent English and these friendly people, they provide us with a service. They take us to see their country. When I tip them, if I tip them, say, $60, that's more than they make in 6 months. And so I've changed their economic future. I've given them access to the department stores, which only take hard currency. I gave them hard currency. And that's the kind of thing, when you multiply that by 100 people in 2010, 2,000 people in 2013, the number is only going to go up, and
so it's the virus of the revolution of rising expectations.
It's rising expectations, and you know there's another source of income that's throwing the party fits too, and that's the black market. There is a significant amount of income coming into an increasing number of wealthy North Koreans who have enough money to bribe the Chinese guards to bring in the goods, including, of all things in the world, South Korean soap operas, which are, you know how the North Koreans find out if people are watching South Korean soap operas? They suddenly, without notice, turn off the electricity and then go looking through people's VCRs to see what they were watching. And that's how they find out. And you know, a lot of those people end up in the gulags. 5 to 10% of the population lives in prison camps eating rat meat. But yeah, these are all things that drive people to the point of saying, we have more to lose than to gain by staying with the same regime. Uncertainty is better than what we're living through now. And as soon as enough people get to that point, and if you have any kind of conflict that sends their children off to war, you're going to have resistance to that. Because look, notwithstanding all the talk about reducing Seoul to flames and bombing North America and all these improbable scenarios, none of their children have ever actually gone to war. Things are as peaceful now in North Korea as they've ever been. After the Korean War, there were a lot of skirmishes that got a lot of Westerners and a lot of North Koreans killed. That's long since passed. Now, instead of just the little crime tape that separates the two countries, now you've got 4 kilometers of separation and fences and underground mines, all these things.
It's not the DMZ.
There's no leakage at the DMZ. People don't pass through because there's still live there's still live grenades and explosives below the surface. They'd have a terrible time eliminating all the explosives from the DMZ, but so that doesn't happen. But they're getting to the tipping point. And I don't know when it'll happen. All right. No one can predict.
But what you're saying is that this execution of Uncle Jang takes them one step closer to that tipping point, because they can now see it's obvious conflict within the leadership.
They've aired their dirty linen. They can't go back. They can't. The workers' paradise is forever banished. They knew it anyway, because when foreigners come in and demonstrate the good life to them, they know that they've known for a long time that they're getting the short end of the stick. The Koreans are not. They're smart people, and to me, they're delightful people. I distinguish between the regime and the nut jobs that are running that country from the population. The reason that I go there is because it's not for some National Geographic reason. The reason I go there is because it's fun.
I understand. Okay. And I know that we all respect you and respect you for that. But you're doing enormous positive things for the United States diplomatic efforts, even in your private capacity.
Well, in my little Walter Mitty mind, not to advertise a new movie that's come out, but in my own mind, yes, I'm a legend, and I think I'm doing all these wondrous things. Maybe I am, maybe I'm not, but I'm trying.
Okay, all right. We're going to talk more after the break, ladies and gentlemen, about the separation or stepping away from China that North Korea is making, and we'll get citizen diplomat Patrick Borders' views on this when we come back. I'm David Day, your host for Asia in Review. I'll see you on the other side of the break.
Aloha, I'm Jay Fidel for ThinkTech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaiian Foreign Trade Zone, number 9, has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBED, the Hawaii Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program. It does so to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Jay Fidel of ThinkTech. Mahalo.
We're back. I'm your host, David Day. You're watching Asia in Review. Our program this evening, North Korea's Crumbling Facade. and our special guest, citizen diplomat Patrick Porter. Nice to have you back, Patrick. And if you just joined the program, you've missed quite a bit. I'd urge you to try to see the full version. But in this final section, we want to talk about what used to be, I think, a stabilizing influence in North Korea, certainly a step in the direction of economic reform, and a diplomatic mentor, if you will, and that was China. And Pat, you've been on the ground in North Korea, and have you seen any changes in the way that North Korea treats China or Chinese that's significant to you?
Yes, one of the major cultural events in North Korea is the mass games. The mass games are held inside of in the Mayday Stadium, which is this gigantic stadium built in 1988 when Kim Il-sung wanted to share in the Seoul Olympics. He was frustrated in that effort, but he still has this huge stadium, and they have what they call the mass games. The mass games have so much participation that they make the Rose Bowl parade look like it happens in a closet. It's over 100,000 people.
And you've seen these yourself. You've been there.
I've seen them more than once. In fact, it's de rigueur. They're rather expensive, but I've always gone to the games. It's usually on the opening night there. And the thing that I noticed this year, meaning 2013, on my last visit, is that all references to China were erased. There used to be about a 10 to 15 minute long segment which was really a tribute to the friendship of their mentor and elder brother, China. That was completely eliminated from the mass games. It was a stinging rebuke to the Chinese, and of course the Chinese are getting increasingly nervous over all these unguided missiles that come from these aberrant rocket launches.
Why was North Korea? Why are they cutting themselves off from their financial supply line? What's?
Well, they've always been, in a sense, a charity case. Even when the Warsaw Pact still existed, it was essentially a barter society between Eastern Europe and those countries in Asia. They were a basket case. I remember when I went through the Soviet Union back in the 70s, I actually got my hands on a pack of North Korean cigarettes. There was absolutely nothing that would commend them to the average consumer, forgetting for the moment the cancer risk. There was just nothing special about them, but they sold what they had, and basically they have nothing to sell most recently, so their petroleum output has been satisfied by Chinese benevolence, and over the years they've done things which are tone deaf. For instance, when they first came up with their 60-foot tall statue of Kim Il-sung, they actually made it out of gold. And the Chinese had something to say about that. And so they melted down the original statue of Kim Il-sung and came up with a bronze version. And now that Kim Jong Un has passed away, they've come up with exactly what North Korea needs, another 60-foot statue of the second great leader, the dear leader. And on Mansudae Hill now, instead of seeing one statue, you see two. But excess in ways that are non-productive, the use of that much of a precious metal to build a statue is not the smartest thing in the world to do. Lately, the Chinese have been very frustrated by the tendency of the Koreans to launch these missiles. They don't like it. It destabilizes the area. The Chinese want a buffer between South Korea and China, so they need for North Korea to lay low and just be a space of land that separates them from U.S. troops.
And so this stinging rebuke, because we're almost out of time, the stinging rebuke is the response of North Korea to China's attempt to
they're tired of
being
being
on a leash.
They're tired of being on a leash. They're tired of being lectured to, and I think the Chinese have actually pulled back on their support. as they threaten to do
So
as a result of all these missile launches.
Okay, so what this putting all this together now, what this means, what you're saying is that the execution of Uncle Jang, that was North Korea's point man for business
Contact.
deals and contacts with China.
That's right.
And so the execution of the point man with China, combined with what you've seen with your own eyes and traveling in Pyongyang at the mass games, suggests that China and North Korea is now on its own. It's isolated. The regime has isolated itself from China.
As isolated as it has ever been.
And another step in the direction of a tipping point.
It's the beginning of the end. How long will that take? Nobody knows. But they're a big step closer to caving in on themselves. North Korea has experienced dry rot for a number of years, and they're getting very close to the time when they'll cave in on themselves, which is why every other foreign government should stand aside, do nothing, and let this happen. No provocative statements, nothing else, because this is an internal struggle, and as long as it remains internal, then let them flame out on their own without any assistance from anyone.
Fascinating advice from a man who has traveled to North Korea several times. You've been listening to our special guest, citizen diplomat Patrick Border. I'm your host, David Day, for Asian Review. Thank you for joining us. You've been watching North Korea's Crumbling Facade, and I'll see you next week.